distinguished RUSI members, DCGS guests, as ACGS, I'm delighted to welcome, on behalf of the Army in London, General Robert Brown to RUSI to deliver the final lecture of the Kermit Roosevelt lecture series. Now, many of you know what the Kermit Roosevelt lecture is about, but I think it's worth a reminder. This annual exchange of lectures stretches right back to 1947 and was started on the initiative of Mrs. Kermit Roosevelt in memory of her husband. He was a son of President Theodore Roosevelt, and this was institutionalized as a series of exchanges of senior officers to provide these lectures. Kermit Roosevelt, an American, was a businessman, soldier, explorer, and writer, and he served with the British Army in both the First and the Second World Wars, which underlines the importance of, I think, the relationship between us. The lecture tour named after him is to develop a closer relationship between individual English and Americans and a better understanding of the military forces of the United States and the United Kingdom and how they would contribute in large measure to the preservation of world peace. This year will be the 71st of the programme, and I think it's particularly appropriate that we welcome our distinguished guest this year, General Robert Brown. With over 30 years of service, General Brown's a warfighter with a pedigree in combined arms manoeuvre on the battlefield and in training, and he's already warned me not to read his complete CV, which I think sense a degree of humility of the General. However, he was commissioned in 1981 and has commanded from platoon to corps. I think most important, he's been central to battlefield and conceptual innovation throughout his career and has commanded the Manoeuvre Centre for Excellence and the Army Combined Arms Centre. On the staff, he was Chief of Staff of US Army Forces in Europe and Assistant Professor of Military Science at West Point. He's also had operational service, of course, in Iraq, Haiti, and Bosnia. And I think as we collectively look at the strategic challenges today, his role in command of the 106,000-strong Pacific Command and his experiences make him well placed to talk about ambiguity and the threats that are constant companions of our military profession. So General Robert Brown is going to talk, the Commanding General of the US Pacific Army Pacific, is going to talk about the changing character of war and thriving in ambiguity and chaos. And Peter, you're going to introduce the subject, I hope, before the General speaks.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
And welcome to RUSI for all of you. Interestingly, on the 11th of May 1982, Henry Kissinger gave a speech in London. And he stated in that speech that the two countries with such divergent traditions, the US and UK, could form such a durable partnership was remarkable in itself. And the periods of that close Anglo-American relationship, the special relationship, the object of such nostalgia today, were also times of occasional mutual exasperation. Kissinger was saying that in 1982, and it's interesting to reflect on the 11th of May 1982, because at that stage, Special Forces from the UK were embarking in HM submarine Onyx. Vulcan bomber raids had taken place on Stanley Airfield, and the sinking of the Belgrano had taken place a few days before. But as we are constantly reminded by our speakers at RUSI, all of those decided nothing. Indeed, H.R. McMaster, when he was here in 2015 at the RUSI Land Warfare Conference, recognized these features as having very little impact on the ultimate conclusions of a war. The nature of conflict, he stated, still required 19-year-olds to get up, fix bayonets, and take land. And that US perspective really persisted last year when we had another brilliant Kermit Roosevelt lecture. General Abrams was here managing to talk for 40 minutes without mentioning money or equipment, something very rare in the UK. But those persistent themes in warfare, that it was about people, that it was about the concepts, are something that we find our own analysis and research at RUSI keep returning to time and time again. Army leaders who are engaged in this discussion are few and far between, and today we have great pleasure in having General Brown to take these themes forward.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Roberts. No pressure there. He mentioned Henry Kissinger spoke on this day, and then H.R. McMaster and General Abrams, all great friends of mine and folks I really admire. So, gosh, I've got a lot of pressure on speaking with those guys, but thanks very much. It was very kind. General Sir Nick, thanks for being here. He has had to listen to this twice, so if you think it's bad for you, he's had to listen to it. This will be his second time, and I really admire that. But this is really proud to be part of the Kermit Roosevelt Lecture. It's one of those things you never think you'll be involved in. You know, you certainly don't look and say, someday I'll be able to do this. And I think, as you heard, the purpose of, how important Kermit Roosevelt felt the UK-US relationship, that special relationship, how important it is, that this, his wife felt this would help bring it together. And a great decision by General George Marshall to approve this. And I've been privileged to be at the last 6 or so Kermit Roosevelt lectures in the United States, and I can say that the British generals do an amazing job. Our soldiers always come away. They're writing furiously, our leaders, and then it does really achieve that closeness that is tough to measure. So it's a real honor to be here. And I'll start with Kermit Roosevelt was an interesting individual. When he signed up in World War I with the American Army, he wanted to see combat. And since he was a son of Teddy Roosevelt, president, they were like, no, you're going nowhere near combat. So he got kind of frustrated, resigned, and joined the British Army, and then saw quite a bit of combat in Mesopotamia to present-day Iraq. And then would also serve in World War II. And some tremendous stories, and just a really interesting Harvard-educated individual and a real adventurer. So again, a real honor to be here to keep that legacy going. Well, I want to talk about the complexity. You mentioned there the changing character of war and how the complexity is changing in the world and what impact that has on all of us. It has an impact on business and anybody in just about any field, but certainly those in the military profession as well. This is a map of the interaction from 2004 to 2014 on the internet, the connectivity of people. Those aren't lights. The brightness you can see initially starts in the United States, Europe, and then starts spreading across the world. And this connectivity is significantly changing things. It's changing the, go ahead and go on to the next slide. You'll see it changes is what I would consider the velocity of human interaction. And here in dark brown that you see is the number of people on the earth, and blue are the number of things connected to the internet. So 2003, there were more people than things connected to the internet. 2008, that shifted. And as you can see up there, by 2020, just 3 years from now, 50 billion things will be connected to the internet. It's an incredible connectivity that has changed everything. In fact, when I was young, and I'll look at some of the soldiers in here with gray hair or no hair, I would say when we were young, the fog of war was not enough information. You'd get 1 or 2 pieces of information, and quite honestly, it was a little bit easier to have initiatives. Now, let's do something, do anything, because you're only getting 1 or 2 pieces of information, and nobody's going to second guess you. What's the fog of war now? Anybody? Too much information. Yeah, overwhelming amounts of information. And so you look, and that changes the equation. Now you have haystacks of information. You're looking for that golden needle to make a decision. But it can be overwhelming, and it changes things like initiative. It changes the speed of what happens. And this is the speed of information moving and how rapidly it diffuses is changing things significantly. And as I mentioned, so it's global connectivity, complexity, and the velocity of human interaction picking up to a point that, in fact, for both the UK and the US militaries, it's changed our very command style. From command and control, very strict, go left, go right, you could control what was happening, to what we call mission command, where you have to empower people. As was mentioned, that talk about how critical people are. Even though technology and this speed and this connectivity, people are even more important because the decisions are made lower and lower, and they must be empowered. And you take a look, there's really a democratization of information. So before, maybe it took a nation state or somebody very well educated with access to this information. Now what do? We Google it. Doesn't necessarily mean it's right, but we can Google it pretty darn quickly. You can find things pretty amazing how rapidly you can find what you need. In fact, I use the example, I have 3 daughters and 4 grandchildren. My oldest granddaughter, when she was 4, could do way more than I could on her mom's iPhone. And then the other interesting fact is, she was a digital native, let's say, very used to it, and I'm a digital immigrant, okay? And so she could do a lot. And then I noticed the other thing is very interesting. She's calling up a cartoon or something, I don't know, Dora the Explorer, one of those shows, and if it took more than a couple seconds, she got frustrated. And I thought, boy, how our expectations have changed. I mean, I was happy when I was a kid, if we had black and white TV, you get the rabbit ears and you could see something. I didn't care what it was. Now she's frustrated, doesn't come up right away, and it's just this change of expectations. And then the information and the access and the connectivity that has led to. And perception has always been significant in conflict, perception. And, as a commander, I know in combat, sometimes it was little things, you wouldn't even really notice it, but a perception could start to form, and that could really shift things, could shift momentum, could shift ideas. An example, I was in Mosul, Iraq, as a Stryker Brigade commander, a city that's been in the news a lot lately. I spent a couple years up there, and we knew we were having elections, first free elections, and we knew that people would expect to see some change after elections, even though we all know it takes time. But so we had some projects that we would do just to show them some progress. And Mosul was a city where nobody was voting. They were stacked up. And then a woman in her 80s walked across the street to vote, and the floodgates opened up. We had to keep the polls open later. So one of the things we did, we just hired folks to paint the curbs yellow. They used to be painted yellow, so let's show progress. Let's get people hired. Let's go out there and paint the curb. Now, mind you, the curbs were blowing up about the same rate as they were before the election from IEDs, et cetera. But people saw, the curbs are being painted, and this perception started spreading rapidly, and pretty soon markets are open, people are out on the streets, and this incredible shift, just from a little thing, the perception that things were getting back to normal, when they weren't quite at that point, but they did with that momentum. Perception is critical, and we used to say, we have to do the right thing while no one is watching, and that's still a really good thing for a military, because you have that character, and you want to do the right thing when no one's watching. But what's also changed is you sit there and say, now you have to do the right thing because the entire world is watching. Something that Private Brown does, Sergeant Brown, General Brown, it doesn't matter. It's going to be on CNN, BBC that night. As you look at how things have changed, nothing that happens in the future, and whether you're in disaster response, humanitarian assistance, or a conflict, it's all going to be blogged, text, tweeted, videoed. There's no more of this, it's going to happen and nobody's going to see it. It's very similar to when you look at a challenge that's happening in the United States right now with the police. And people are capturing videos of the police. Now, they've had the same methods for a while, but nobody saw it. And now you see it, and it's unacceptable. Should have always been unacceptable, but you never saw it. Now the whole world sees it. Another one is airlines. I flew over on United Airlines. I was a little bit worried, right? Although I thought, hey, if I make some statements and they drag me off, I get a couple $1 million, right? They settle. Anyway, no, I'm only kidding. But it is, that's what's happening. The whole world sees, and this has changed things quite a bit, and we'll see that continues. So as you look, and that's the world in general. Now let me focus in on the Pacific region, the complexity in the region I'm in, and where I have my 100,000 plus troops. And we're dealing with these issues. Let me focus in on that a little bit. We like to say the Pacific is 52% of the Earth's surface, the Indo-Asia-Pacific region. And I know some folks I've worked with in here are experts, and so it's really great to see you here. But it's a complex region, 36 nations, 16 time zones, thousands of languages, very complex region. And we'll say it's from Hollywood to Bollywood, from penguins to polar bears, the Pacific. And you look, so my responsibility from the West Coast, I actually have forces on the West Coast of the United States, up in Alaska, and then all the way down Japan, Hawaii, Korea, Guam, American Samoa, Saipan, et cetera. And But as you look, this circle up here that you see is not even, so the Pacific AOR is all this. Isn't even all of the Pacific AOR, but the interesting fact is more people live inside this circle than in the rest of the world put together. So more people live inside this circle, which isn't even all of the Pacific AOR, but more people live inside this circle than in the rest of the world altogether. And then by 2050, there'll be 7 out of 10 people in the world will live inside this circle. 7 out of 10. So you can see there's great opportunity within that circle. There's also great competition for resources and other things that exist there. And the 7 of the 10 largest armies in the world reside in the Pacific, which is another fact, because sometimes people say, you know, there's a lot of blue. Isn't it just a naval or an air theater? But people live on the land, and 7 of the 10 largest armies are on the land there. And then you have, for us, when you look at a very important thing we're looking at, I'm sure many of you, is this trend in megacities. Cities that are 10 million people or more growing. By 2050, they say 75% of the world will live in a megacity, and they're just growing like crazy. There's 36 currently in the world, megacities. 24 of them are in the Pacific. And quite honestly, that surprised me. When we were looking at it, 24 out of 36 megacities in the Pacific. And megacities, of course, come with their own challenges and issues. So as we look at this very complex area, and I'll dive into the 5 challenges we recognize in the United States. All right, there's a great picture. I showed this to a group of young cadets at West Point. I was talking about this, and they were just thrilled. They said, "Wow, that's impressive, sir. How'd you get that picture?" They had visions of a little mini UAV flying over here or something. I don't know, but. And I always make some comment on that good-looking haircut there, because you just have to. But anyway, nice little propaganda picture there. But of the 5 challenges we recognize, the first that's obviously in the Pacific and is the number one most significant, and what keeping me up at night is North Korea right now, in this incredibly belligerent attitude towards the world of trying to develop a capability, of course, that Kim Jong-un is doing. And I'll show you a little chart here. This is going all the way back to his father's regime. His father, I think, in 35 rockets in 19 years, and he's up well up over 100 already just in his short time. And these are all so he's after a capability here. You know, some would say, well, maybe it's the aggressive posture that's causing this. No, this goes back, and he is trying to get that capability to reach out with nuclear weapons, chemical weapons, and reach out and extend. And part of that, I believe, is because his conventional forces, while this is the only part of the world, when you look, a 1 million-man army in North Korea facing a 1 million-man army in South Korea, right there with the demilitarized zone. Of course, an armistice, the war was never concluded, right across from each other. And sometimes we forget that, because it's been 60-plus years. And a lot of hard work to maintain that peace and stability. Sometimes we forget that, but it's a very tense situation, particularly with what's going on right now. And then you look, Russia is in the Pacific. They just flew a Bear bomber around Japan, circled Japan. They just flew it for 5th day in a row. It hasn't happened in a long time. A Bear bomber right up to the edge of Alaska. We had to deal with that. And then, of course, China in the Pacific. And I was just, it was 6 months ago over in China. And the challenges, as you look, competition doesn't mean that your competitors and conflict. Competition is there. And certainly when I was over there, we were doing a disaster management exchange with about 1,000 U.S. soldiers and some 1,500 Chinese soldiers, and it was just fascinating to see the team work together. And my emphasis was on things we've had in common, going way back to the Flying Tigers in World War II, where U.S. pilots flew for the Chinese Air Force, and then lately, going a little more recent example, to Ebola, when our 101st Airborne Division went over to Africa to stop the spread of Ebola, and many nations sent folks to help, from doctors to troops, and China sent a tremendous medical detachment that made a huge difference. So it's working together. So you find areas in common so you can talk about the differences. Because otherwise, if you just concentrate on the differences, it's not good for anybody. It's going to lead to conflict, and that would be a shame. But both China and Russia in the Pacific, I do often wonder what they're toasting. And is that vodka or is it baijiu, the Chinese baijiu? And I'm guessing vodka tastes better, But all right, go ahead, next slide. So then you look. This is an example. Fiery Cross Reef and the Spratly Islands at high tide is underwater, and it's rocks. And if you look over 10 years, then the massive reclamation efforts. This is 2016 Fiery Cross Reef, and again, this is where you do get into. Where we're not militarizing these now not classified officially as islands, but structures where they did these huge reclamation efforts. There's a runway, hangars, fuel supply, unknown structures that all of it looks extremely military, and has military equipment landing there and being there. So this is part of the challenge we're facing, the complexity that's going on in the world today, and this is only in the Pacific. Okay, and then as I mentioned, bear bombers. Being very aggressive off the coast of Alaska, had to intercept them with some of our F-22s here recently, and the complexity, not just in Europe of Russia and Ukraine and other, but here in the Pacific as well. And then we also have, unfortunately, I wish I could say we're in great shape and that's it, but we also have violent extremist organizations in the Pacific, and as they're being pushed out of other areas. Be it the Middle East or Africa, they're flowing in, finding places to go. As I mentioned, the expanse of the Pacific, and they're being found in Bangladesh, Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia. Recently, about 30 violent extremist organizations pledged to ISIL in Indonesia. Now, the good news is Indonesia has an excellent counterterrorism cell and efforts, being the largest Muslim country in the world. In our AOR, and so they're getting after it, but again, they're there, violent extremist organizations, and a huge concern for everybody, as it should be. And then the most likely thing, when you look at the complexity in the world, but in the Pacific in particular, is a disaster response. This is a typhoon that hit the Philippines, but 7 out of 10 people killed in the world in a disaster, it happens in the Pacific, 7 out of 10. The Rim of Fire, of course. And so the most likely thing we're going to do, and as I mentioned, we work very closely with every nation in the Pacific to save lives when this does happen. And sometimes these things are so complex, like in Japan a few years ago, you almost couldn't make it up. I was talking, the Japanese were helping us as we're preparing for this, and they were saying that they were going to have an exercise where they had an earthquake, a tsunami, and a nuclear disaster. And everybody said, oh, that's not realistic. And like 6 months later, it happened. So, it's unfortunate. I wish, again, I could say it doesn't happen, but it does. So there's the complexity. Okay, so what do you do about this complexity? And I just went through how the world is changing and things are changing. And so this has changed for military, for us. This has changed, and get back to the theme Dr. Roberts mentioned here. The key is people are our advantage. And I would say that is for the UK military and the US. And when you look, if this is existing material solutions. So those things you have, be it a tank, piece of equipment, of course we want the best equipment, and we're very proud what we have and how our nation supports us getting the best equipment. But the reality is, how long does that advantage last now? Again, when I was much younger, I had a lot more hair and it wasn't gray, we owned the night, for example. We would do things at night because we had the night vision capability. UK had it as well that nobody else had. So there's a significant technological advantage for many years. Well, unfortunately, now today you look and you might have a slight advantage, but then you can buy it on the internet, better technology and faster, obviously, or you can 3D print it, or you can copy it relatively quickly because of the access to information and this democratization of information that's occurring. So we want the best equipment, but in this graph you see clear and present threats. So North Korea over here. If North Korea would do a conventional attack, those existing material solutions would work extremely well, combined with the tough, demanding, realistic training, the ironclad alliance and the sending states, 22 sending states that are committed there in the peninsula, would defeat North Korea. No question. However, most nations, they're not out there looking at going after your strengths, they're looking at going after your weaknesses. And you start to look over here as this strategic uncertainty grows. And you look at things that Russia's doing, like with the little green men. You know, we see, we call what China's doing in South China Sea, like with little green fishermen, right? And some of these things that they're doing. You move over to ISIL, cyber threats, amorphous, ambiguous threats. The farther you move over on strategic uncertainty, the less value are those material solutions. They just aren't as valuable because people aren't going after your strength. And the cognitive demands on the soldier increase. So this is no longer, years ago, the individual just do rote repetition and do what I say, and we don't want you thinking. No, these have to be really well-developed, well-trained to be agile, adaptive leaders, solve those complex problems in a timely manner with a creative solution. And when you look at this, our hedge against uncertainty is these cohesive teams of Army professionals, the professionals being key, even more today than ever before, because folks will try to drag you down. And what happens if you do have a lapse in judgment or whatever? It's shown everywhere. You can't hide it. It's going to be everywhere. The whole world is watching. These professionals, cohesive teams that thrive in conditions of uncertainty and chaos. We used to say, be comfortable in conditions of uncertainty and ambiguity and chaos. Comfort doesn't win. I think it was a good goal as things were changing, and everybody's trying to figure this out. Wow, this is unbelievable, this overwhelming amounts of info, the speed of everything picking up. Comfort was probably a good goal, but you've got to get beyond that. If you want to be effective, you've got to thrive. You have leaders that thrive, and that's what we're working extremely hard in our training and our development and in working with our partners, allies, and friends. And another key aspect of this is leader development. And here's an example. It's the best example of this, I think. You can recognize, obviously, General Eisenhower on the plains of Salisbury. I was there when I got to speak to 3rd Division earlier in the lecture series, and what an honor to be there, and where the 101st was. Here's General Eisenhower talking right before D-Day, and you all know who that is. Does anybody know who this is? Maybe a little tougher to see there. Anybody? For a coin. Okay, and that's usually one lecture up in one div. A soldier knew it, a real historian, and I gave him a coin. He was thrilled, but it was pretty impressive. That's Fox Connor. Fox Connor. Now, that might ring a bell some of you. There's a book, The Gray Fox, and it's about mentorship on Fox Connor. Fox Connor also, incidentally, was commanded the same organization I am now, U.S. Army Pacific. That's not why he's up here, but I didn't realize that until... But what Fox Connor did, Fox Connor was a great mentor. And the example I'll give you here, Fox Connor was mentoring a young lad named George Patton as a major, okay? And Patton invited one of his friends, Dwight Eisenhower, another major, over to dinner at Fox Connor's house. Eisenhower had missed World War I, and if you read anything about Eisenhower, you thought, that's it, my career's over, I missed the war. He did not get selected for our Command General Staff College. Now, in those days, if you didn't get selected, you would not be promoted. He would have retired a major. In fact, you were promoted based on how you finished in the class, the Command General Staff College class. So Eisenhower was not going. He would not have been promoted. Fox Connor at that dinner said, boy, this guy has a lot of potential. Connor gets assigned to Panama. He has Eisenhower go to Panama with him, and he starts to have Eisenhower read things like Clausewitz on War, twice, by the way. It's hard to read once, but he had him read it twice. And he's quizzing him on it, and again, Eisenhower's response was, you know, he re-sparked my passion for the profession of arms, my love of the profession of arms and reading and military. And then Fox Connor, as a mentorship role, he had to work it. He said, look, Eisenhower, you're going to Indiana in a National Guard unit, and you're going to transfer to be an AG officer, a personnel officer. And you got to imagine Eisenhower saying, what? What's going on here? I'm an infantryman. Well, he got picked up for Command General Staff College as a personnel officer. Gets to Command General Staff College, and Fox Connor helps get him back to being an infantryman. And infantry branch says, Eisenhower, you're not going to make it. I've actually seen it where they said, look, you're not going to make it. And he finishes number 1 in the class and is promoted. The rest is history. You wouldn't know who I was talking about. Did a pretty good job. World War II, would later be a president. You wouldn't even know who I was talking about. It wasn't for the mentorship of Fox Connor. He also mentored a guy named Omar Bradley and a little bit of mentorship to George Marshall. So pretty good record, and it's a great book. But as I talk about, leader development is critical. It's absolutely critical. I can guarantee you any of the senior leaders in this room would tell you they wouldn't be here without the leader development that occurred. I know I certainly wouldn't be. But we get busy. And in everything, again, leader development's important in corporations, important in any field where you want to be successful, but you get busy, and it's not always the first thing. And the other thing is you don't get immediate results. Sometimes you don't immediately see the result, but I can tell you it's the most rewarding thing. So leader development, absolutely critical. You take that and apply it to the philosophy I discussed earlier, mission command. Because what happened, the U.S. Army in 2008 switched from command, in the middle of two wars, switched from command and control, where it was very hierarchical, going up and down the chain, stop, go left, go right, little bit of empowerment, but not much. And we realized this doesn't work. It's too slow. Because of the speed and the connectivity and this incredible velocity of human interaction, it's way too slow. We've got to empower. And the first thing in that is building trust. Absolutely key. That's why on this visit I've been so excited to see some of the tremendous programs the UK has, like adventure training. Adventure training builds trust. It pushes people. They go out there, they push themselves to the limit, and they build trust as a team. It's fantastic and perfect for mission command. And then creating shared understanding, clear intent, exercising discipline, initiative, using mission orders. Tell them exactly what to do. Tell them what you want to accomplish. And then what is the prudent risk? Some people think mission command is just go do whatever you want to do. No, not at all. You got to know your subordinates. And I was in combat. I had one battalion commander. I could give him free rein and, pretty much wide. Another one, a little bit more narrow. He's more tentative, less experienced. Left and right limits come up and get guidance. So you know your subordinates. But mission command, and it's key because it enables you to empower these folks to keep up with this speed and this velocity today. It's also key, I will tell you, that not many armies can do it. Militaries, but armies are concentrated on here. Not many armies can do it. UK can, US can, Australia. There's some others, but I'll tell you, it's tough to do, but it's a key, huge, huge advantage. So let me give you a couple of examples of that. One from World War II, and then one from more present day. This is, I won't even ask anybody knows him, because I asked that in a lecture one time, and a smart-ass cadet yelled out, "Is that you, sir?" And, back when I had a mustache here in the big one, WW2, I guess, So anyway, I gave the kid a coin because that took a lot of courage, what the heck, But I also gave his name to the superintendent at West Point. And, but this is a tremendous story here, and because, again, in the UK-US relationship, this goes back to how long did we plan the Normandy invasion? I know there's a historian out here that's the exact answer, but I'll take an even approximate answer. How long do we plan the Normandy invasion, even anybody? What's that? 2 years. About 2 years, Some would say 2.5, some would argue 3, but 2 years. Probably no operation with greater amount of detail and planning. I mean, I mentioned George Patton, he was the deception operation, a whole fake division, and if you read it, it's just fascinating. You read about all that was done. And my point here is there was a lot of effort done, and we got on the beaches. A lot of hard work, but then we were stuck. And we were stuck by these things, the hedgerows, right, in France. The enemy gets a vote. The hedgerows that divided the acreage for years, and the Germans were very smart, and they used those to channelize us to the road, so we were having trouble. And I think it would have been better. I often say, it would have been better if maybe the Germans had built these giant concrete walls days before, so the planners didn't miss this. It just happened. Well, that's not the case. They'd been there a long time. So you need a plan. A plan's important, that's for sure. You got a baseline to go from. But a plan's never perfect, and you need folks like Sergeant Cullen. So what did Sergeant Cullen do? He was a young E5 buck sergeant, engineer. And he hears about this dilemma. Obviously, he's there. And on the beaches, he sees the hexagons left to prevent boats from coming in, left by the Germans on the beaches. He cuts those off and has the idea to weld it to the front of a tank. This is a much later developed, probably an acquisition program, took 10 years. But I know that the initial was just welding that blade, and this is the hedgerow, those thick things. But anyway, Sergeant Cullen's idea saved the day and enabled them to cut through the hedgerows, and the rest is history, right? They were victorious. But the fascinating thing about this is, what army would listen to an E5 buck sergeant from the beaches in Normandy with an idea that would go all the way up the chain? And I researched this when I was at National War College, because I was taking a striker brigade, a brand new concept, and doing the test and evaluation of that and deploying it to Iraq, and we needed innovation. And so I wanted to use this as an example. And one of the first, most important example was they listened to him from the bottom up. And that a lot of armies would not have, and wouldn't today still. All right, a UK would listen to him, a US would listen to him. As, you know, there's other nations that would, but since I'm here and we're talking this special relationship. But that's amazing. That we would listen and it could come from the bottom up. That's just a philosophy that we've had. Also, when I was, as I mentioned, I was at National War College studying this, so I went to the National Center for Military History and I tracked, and sure enough, it's kind of interesting, everybody tried to take credit for this, from general, colonel, major, this idea. But Eisenhower's letter is to Sergeant Cullen, and the award and the recognition to Sergeant Cullen, who would go on and fight the rest of the war. He would lose a leg in the war, but live, and I found that fascinating, and it's typical. Those guys are probably saying it was a bad idea. Next thing you know, they're claiming credit for it. Poor Sergeant Cullen, but he got the credit from Eisenhower. So it's amazing. Now a more modern-day story. This is a taxi cab in Iraq, and up in the city of Mosul, been in the news a lot lately. And it's an old car, but they do a great job of keeping those running. They paint them orange and white in their taxis. There's 4,000 of these taxis running around Mosul. And Al-Qaeda, come up with some pretty devious ideas of how to have an impact and go after weaknesses. So what they do, they started stuffing the taxis with explosives, creating an SV bid, a suicide vehicle, and they would drive into normally innocent civilian women and children. Tragically, I saw a 6-year-old boy melted into the sidewalk, one of these, and it's a hole half the size of this front area up here, and just terrible. So the challenge was, I had 11,000 forces from the Syrian border, Turkish border, the Iranian border, but even if I had the number of forces, I couldn't have stopped all 4,000 taxis. So it's a pretty devious thing to do, and if I did stop all the taxis, the people were still using them. Even though occasionally they were blowing up, they were still using them. They had to get around and get their livelihood in a city of 1.3 million, and so pretty clever. So a young company commander, empowered, working in a sector where we had 500. Actually, it's the part they're fighting for right now, the most dense part of Mosul. 500,000 people in his sector. There's 182 soldiers in his company, and he knew that there was a taxi cab union. Okay, I was the brigade commander, a colonel. I didn't know that. Now I had lots of stuff going on, elections, border, all kinds of stuff. But he knew his area. He'd built a rapport with the people, and he knew there was a taxi cab union. So he gets them together. It's really important. He didn't just come up with his solution. He asked them for their input, and they come up with the answer. They say, why don't we remove our trunk lids? And you can see, if you look closely, that lid, trunk lid is gone. Really clever idea, because now you don't have to stop every taxi. You can look pretty quickly and see if the trunk is empty or full. And obviously, if they stuff the passenger compartment, they got curtains around or something, it's going to be pretty obvious. So it's a pretty clever solution. And the Iraqi taxi cab drivers came up with that. So the next morning, they go out and they determine to take their trunk lids off. Again, the enemy gets a vote. The enemy grabs a taxi cab driver, cuts his head off, puts a sign up, says, if you remove your trunk lids, this will happen to you. So they all go, ooh, wait a minute, never mind. The young company commander gets them back together, same day. Hey, come on now, there's 4,000 of you, there's a bunch of us, we're going to stop this, we'll work together. The next day I went out, as I did every day, in my Striker, moving around and didn't know what we'd see. 4,000 taxis had their trunk lids off, and we never had another car bomb in a taxi again. Now they moved on to another problem, but that was a young leader, an agile, a complex problem. People are dying. Innocent people are dying. You got to solve it in a creative solution in a timely manner. You don't have a whole lot of time. People are dying. And that's an agile leader and solving that. And what I saw is that hundreds of times a day. And all of you out there, the soldiers who deployed, saw the same thing. It's amazing. And it's more and more and more. Down at that lower level, the edge is where the best ideas come from. For a couple of reasons. One, their lives depend on it. There's a lot of incentive. The other is they're closest to the problem. It's not the generals that have the tremendous solution. It's those closest to the problem. How do you get those ideas back up? And we did some things in Iraq, like even having a rapid adaptation cell where a soldier at any location could submit ideas when there was a problem. And we'd get overwhelming amounts of ideas shared through that connectivity I was talking about earlier. Pretty amazing. And that helps you be incredibly successful and spread those ideas and actually get inside the enemy's decision cycle, which we used to talk about a lot. but kind of got away from. So that's thriving in ambiguity and chaos, like this famous picture here, kind of chaos all around, and the young Iraqi boy hiding behind the soldier because he is in control and thriving in that environment, and that's the direction we need to go. So that's the people, our advantage, empowered, okay? But you can't just have people. You got to have concepts and doctrine. You know, great people, the concepts and doctrine. And this is our latest. I've been working on this with a couple people mentioned here. General Perkins, who's our trade doc. When I was in my last job, I was working this with H.R. McMaster and Perkins. I work in this constantly. General Abrams mentioned he's been involved in this. It's really air-land battle that we did in the 70s. It led to great success in Desert Shield, Desert Storm, plus other domains. Air-land battle, because what's happened is we are no longer dominant in all domains. And that's not an infantry guy saying that up here. It's a reality of the changes in technology, the changes out there that are occurring. And so we used to be able to have dominance at sea and in the air. Last 60 years, I mean, we never had to look up and worry, was it enemy or friendly? It was always friendly. We had that dominance. We don't have it anymore. So we have to look at how we're going to go about this. And the multi-domain battle is the effort that we're looking at. And we're leading the way in the Pacific, developing a multi-domain task force, one that we'll work in the Pacific, we'll work in Europe, and we'll have capabilities. And the first thing we've got to do, though, this is the absolute key, is this mindset change to joint integration. We all grow up in stovepipes. It's how we're brought up. Our acquisition programs are in stovepipe. You might have some things to pull us together, and in the United States we had gold, water, nickels to make us more joint, but we're in stovepipes. And we even have things within our own service that can't share information well enough, let alone between the services. Now we have some things, like Link 16, that's really old now, but it enabled me, to pull in a feed from a fighter jet and watch on a screen in a Stryker going 60 miles an hour, a car in front of us that had an insurgent in it, and coordinate things, and enabled us to do stuff like that way back in 2004, but that's not even close to good enough. We have joint interdependence right now. We depend on each other, but we got to move towards joint integration. That is absolutely key, and we're moving that way in the Pacific, I can tell you. And we say sensor agnostic and platform agnostic. Does it matter if it's a Navy asset that picks up something and an Army asset that engages it, or vice versa, or Air Force and Navy, or cyber and another force? It doesn't matter. Platform and sensor and platform agnostic. You've got to present in this concept multiple dilemmas to those that would do you harm. Because if you look, those that have been watching and learning, they have set up complex A2AD denial. They can handle linear 1, 2, 3 things at a time. They cannot handle complex multiple dilemmas, maneuver in multiple domains to a position of relative advantage. And the domains with the greatest potential are cyber and space. They also have the greatest restrictions, policy restrictions, and new and greatest challenges, no doubt. But they are the ones with the greatest potential. And so this is key, the multiple dilemmas presented. And what it will provide is multiple options to your leadership if you do it right. As I said, we've got about 30 exercises testing this with all forces in the Pacific, concluding with the largest maritime exercise in the world, RIMPAC. That's going to be all-domain exercise now. And we'll see ground forces engaging ships at sea, cyber play, space, all domains in play, and that'll be in 2018, RIMPAC. And then we'll move on in 2019 in the Pacific. U.S. Army Pacific is leading the way for the Army, and the joint forces will have actually the first multi-domain task force moving around the Pacific for 9 to 10 months in the Pacific theater. And again, it'll be in the Pacific, different terrain, but it won't look much different than what would be anywhere else at multi-domain and those capabilities. So let me just look at a couple of takeaways. I've thrown a lot of stuff at you, people, a whole new concept. So I just want to, just a quick, the complexity and the changing character. So what are we going to do about it? Well, we talked about that soldier's role is key. More demands than ever. You got to educate. You got to train. How you select them, and then you got to empower them, no doubt about it, because we've got some challenges. Leader development, education, and experience are key. The U.S. Army, for example, we just recently created Army University, combining 180-some schools to put them under a university structure to improve the quality and rigor of education. And it's key, because education is so key. Tough, demanding, realistic training. Empower them through Mission Command. Who's your Sergeant Cullen out there? And they've got to be empowered using Mission Command. And then you look at, again, tough training And technology that empowers people to make decisions faster, empowers people, artificial intelligence, it's come up in the last couple talks. Well, what about someday, the use of artificial intelligence? We're seeing it already. Autonomous vehicles. So maybe you don't have to have, people in a resupply vehicle. It can be autonomous and wherever you could. But, those people are going to have to be there making those key decisions and showing that judgment that we don't think artificial intelligence will ever get to, and things like empathy and other things that are so key in some of these situations, no doubt. But there's certainly a role for it. And then the ability to thrive in ambiguity and chaos. Not comfortable, but thriving is absolutely key. Nobody's going to do this alone. You'd have to be crazy. Multinational, that's why I'm so glad we're here. The special relationship with the UK, but all our allies. I mean, we have amazing relationships, and they're critical. Now here, I've been in U.S. Army Europe, and I know that tremendous NATO tie is fantastic. We don't have a NATO-like structure in the Pacific, but we have amazing alliances and amazing friends and allies and partners multinationally. In fact, of our 7 alliances in the world, 5 are in the Pacific. Japan, Korea, Philippines, Thailand, and Australia. 5 of 7, and those alliances are strong, and they're key because we're not going to do it alone. I got a rare picture over here of Bradley, Montgomery, and Patton smiling, right? So it was always like that. They were always happy with each other, and it was never a problem. We know that. And then, it's also key. This is not in this complex world. I can't ever foresee a time it's going to be a military-only solution. There's no way. Whole of government is key. I mean, the whole of government approach is that and again, another lesson learned. It's about cooperation and collaboration. And my first time in Iraq, I was trying, but the State Department rep just couldn't get in sync. He wouldn't leave the fob. We just couldn't get. The next time I was there, a few years later, we did everything together. We called it Team Nineveh, and everything we did was together. And we found that had a heck of a lot more success. We didn't have stuff rusting out in the desert. Things worked. The whole of government approach is key. Interagency and NGOs and their key role, and all those folks working together because these are complex problems. No doubt about it, for sure. So when you look, are we going to be victims of complexity? As you've heard about UAS swarms. There's a giant one that could cause you to be a victim of complexity. I would prefer to be masters of complexity, thriving in ambiguity and chaos, and using those to our advantage and using all this to our advantage. It doesn't mean there aren't going to be black swans out there, and these things that come out of nowhere. In fact, I would say that is the new norm. And, when you look, we used to kind of as planners, we'd be shamed if we didn't predict something. I think today it's impossible. The world is so complex. Things will come out of nowhere. The power of a few people is greater than ever before because of this connectivity and this access to information. It's greater than ever before. In some cases, those that would, the connectivity on the internet, if it was all for people doing good things, it'd be wonderful. But it's not. They're trying to steal your bank account. They're tying together. They're putting out, in many cases, propaganda, lies, and they can do that rapidly, more rapidly than when you tell the truth, because telling the truth takes time, and you got to verify it and everything else. So there's some challenges. We've got to be masters of complexity. I think this is a winning formula, working together, the right people, empowered, the right concept, and that as we move forward, we can handle any of the things thrown at us. And I think I stole a quote from Prime Minister May here, and some of you may not be able to read, so I'll read it. The world is passing through a period of change, and in response to that change, we can either be passive bystanders or we can take the opportunity once more to lead and lead together, which I think is exactly right, so absolutely key. So I look forward to your questions. I think if you don't mind, I'll sit down to answer the questions. I just had knee replacement a few weeks ago. And while it's a new knee, it's the same damn old muscles and tendons and all that stuff. And they didn't tell me that. But anyway, so I really look forward to the questions. And thanks for your patience. A real honor to be here, part of the Kermit Roosevelt lecture. And let's have some great dialogue.